In December 1856, on a blood-stained operating table in rural Georgia, the roles of doctor and patient were about to reverse in the most shocking way imaginable. Esther Cooper, a slave who had been forced to assist in brutal medical experiments on her own mother, was finally ready to give her master's physician a taste of his own medicine literally. But what drives a person to transform from helpless witness into methodical executioner, and how far would you go to avenge the one person who meant everything to you? December 1856. The Georgia air hangs thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp sting of chloroform. In the basement of the Hamilton plantation house, where mahogany floors give way to rough-hewn planks, a makeshift operating theater hums with the quiet efficiency of routine horror. Dr. Thomas Hamilton adjusts his spectacles with hands that never tremble, never hesitate. Above him, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over leather-bound medical journals and brandy decanters. Below, oil lamps flicker across instruments of steel that gleam like predators' teeth in the uncertain light. Esther Cooper stands motionless beside the wooden table, her 28 years etched in the careful stillness of survival. Her fingers, nimble from years of cotton picking, now hold surgical clamps with the precision born of terrible necessity. She knows each instrument by touch, by weight, by the specific kind of agony it delivers: the bone saw, the speculum, the crude forceps that Hamilton designed himself for his particular brand of experimentation. This is her world now, this chamber, where enslaved women disappear into medical history as unnamed subjects in groundbreaking gynecological research. Her mother Sarah lies before them, consciousness flickering like the lamplight. No anesthesia, Hamilton believes it interferes with his observations of natural responses to pain. The contrast is suffocating. Upstairs, Hamilton's wife sips tea from delicate porcelain while discussing the latest fashions from Atlanta. Down here, Esther watches her mother's fingers claw at nothing, searching for something to hold on to as the scalpel finds its mark again. The floorboards above creak with the gentle footsteps of comfort and privilege. The floorboards below are stained dark with the evidence of Hamilton's dedication to science. This is December 1856, when medical advancement requires no consent, no consideration, no humanity from certain kinds of bodies. When the same hands that shake in greeting at church socials on Sunday carve experimental incisions on Monday morning. When progress demands sacrifice, and enslaved women provide both the altar and the offering. But something shifts in the winter air that night. Sarah Cooper's breathing grows shallow, then stops entirely. The rhythm that has governed Esther's existence for 28 years simply ends, like a clock winding down to silence. Hamilton makes careful notes in his leather journal, documenting the procedure's duration, the subject's responses, the final outcome. He wipes his hands clean on a towel that Esther will later burn, then heads upstairs for supper, leaving her alone with the cooling body of her mother and the sudden, crushing weight of understanding. For years, Esther has been the perfect assistant, compliant, silent, invisible. She has handed him instruments like a prayer, hoping that cooperation might somehow lessen the suffering. She has cleaned blood from his tools and prepared the next subject, telling herself that resistance would only bring more pain. But as she covers her mother's face with the same rough cloth that has covered dozens of others, something crystallizes in her mind, like ice forming on winter water. She knows every one of Hamilton's movements, every technique, every vulnerability. She has absorbed medical knowledge through forced proximity, learning anatomy through the screams of her people, understanding surgical precision through watching it inflict maximum damage with clinical efficiency. Her hands no longer shake when they hold the instruments. Her stomach no longer turns at the sight of blood. Hamilton has trained her well, though not in the way he intended. The transformation begins in the silence after Sarah's last breath. Esther's grief doesn't erupt in tears or wails, it calcifies into something harder, colder, more dangerous. She begins to notice things she never saw before. How Hamilton always arrives alone for his late-night procedures. How he locks the door from the inside. How his confidence makes him careless about his own safety. She memorizes his routines with the same attention he pays to his experimental subjects, cataloging his habits like symptoms, his weaknesses like diagnoses, waiting for the right treatment. In the weeks that follow, Esther moves through her days like a sleepwalker, but her mind burns with newfound clarity. She understands now that Hamilton's research depends entirely on the helplessness of his subjects, on their inability to fight back or refuse consent. But what would happen if those dynamics suddenly reversed? What would happen if the one person who knew his methods better than anyone else decided to turn that knowledge against him? The question follows her through December's frozen mornings and into the long dark nights where she lies awake planning not escape. Escape is for those who still believe in somewhere safe to run. Esther Cooper has a different destination in mind, and every step of the journey will unfold in Hamilton's own operating theater, using his own carefully sharpened tools, following his own methodical approach to the systematic infliction of enlightening pain. January arrives with the kind of bone-deep cold that makes everything sharp and brittle. Hamilton maintains his schedule with the punctuality of a church bell. Late evening procedures, when the plantation house settles into sleep and his wife retires to her chambers with laudanum and French novels. Tonight, he comes alone, as always, carrying his leather satchel of instruments, like a country doctor making house calls. But Esther waits in the shadows between the oil lamps, her breathing controlled, her pulse steady as a metronome. She has prepared everything with the same meticulous attention Hamilton demands of his own work. The restraints are ready. The instruments are arranged in precise order. The table is positioned exactly where the lamplight will illuminate every detail of what comes next. Hamilton enters whistling softly, a hymn he learned in childhood, the same melody that has accompanied dozens of procedures. He doesn't notice Esther until the heavy wooden door clicks shut behind him and the key turns in the lock. When he turns, she stands beside his operating table with her hands folded, patient as a prayer. The moment stretches between them like a blade finding its target. Hamilton's eyes narrow, then widen as understanding dawns. He reaches for his walking stick, but Esther moves with the fluid precision of someone who has rehearsed this scene 1,000 times in the theater of her mind. The walking stick clatters across the floor. Hamilton stumbles backward against his own table, the irony lost on no one. "You will lie still," Esther says, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who has finally found their proper role in this particular drama. Just as she did. Just as they all did. Hamilton struggles. But years of wielding instruments have made Esther's hands strong, and years of watching procedures have taught her exactly where to apply pressure to render resistance futile. The restraints click into place, with the finality of closing coffin lids. Now Hamilton discovers what his subjects have always known: how the leather straps bite into wrists, how the table's rough wood presses against spine, how vulnerability tastes when it fills your mouth like blood. Esther selects her instruments with theatrical deliberation, holding each one up to the lamplight so Hamilton can see it clearly. First, the long surgical knife. She grips it firmly, letting the blade catch the flickering flame until it gleams like liquid fire. She holds it there, suspended between them, a moment frozen in amber where predator and prey finally understand their true positions. Then the scalpel that opened her mother's abdomen. The forceps that gripped and twisted. The bone saw that Hamilton claimed advanced the understanding of pelvic anatomy. Each tool carries the weight of specific memories, specific screams, specific moments when Esther stood helpless and complicit. Now, she becomes surgeon, and Hamilton becomes subject, and the cycle completes itself with mathematical precision. His eyes follow her movements with the desperate attention of someone finally understanding the true nature of his life's work. She begins exactly as he always did, with careful explanation of the procedure, clinical description of what comes next, professional reassurance that everything serves the greater good of scientific advancement. The operation proceeds with textbook precision, every cut calculated, every incision purposeful. Hamilton experiences his own methodology from an entirely new perspective, discovering how his techniques feel when applied by hands that learned their skill through forced observation of unspeakable cruelty. Esther works with the focused concentration of a master craftsman, her movements economical and exact. She has become the perfect student of his teachings, demonstrating her mastery of every lesson he never intended to impart. The basement fills with sounds Hamilton has heard countless times before, though never quite like this, never with himself as the source, never with such personal investment in the outcome. When it ends, Hamilton's breathing has the same ragged quality that marked the final moments of so many others. Esther cleans her instruments, methodically, exactly as she always has, returning each one to its proper place in his leather satchel. She unlocks the door and walks upstairs into the pre-dawn darkness, where other slaves are already stirring for another day's labor. She doesn't run, she doesn't hide. She simply returns to her quarters and waits for the inevitable discovery, for the questions that will follow, for the trial that will transform her from anonymous victim into legendary symbol. By sunrise, plantation hands find Hamilton in his operating theater, positioned exactly as he left so many others. The discovery ripples through the slave quarters like whispered prayer, spreading from cabin to cabin with the velocity of hope long deferred. Word travels the Underground Railroad networks faster than bloodhounds, carrying Esther's name into folk songs and freedom stories. Her trial becomes theater, drawing crowds who come to witness something unprecedented, a slave woman who refused to accept her designated role in the grand performance of Southern civilization. The verdict surprises no one. The sentence follows swiftly, but Esther Cooper's story has already escaped the confines of courtroom and gallows, transforming into something larger than individual revenge. She becomes the answer to a question that haunted slave quarters across the South. What happens when the powerless finally claim power? Her name passes between lovers in cotton fields, between mothers teaching children about dignity, between runaways following the North Star towards something resembling justice. They tell how she turned Hamilton's own methods against him, how she demonstrated that knowledge cuts both ways, how even the most carefully constructed systems of oppression contain the seeds of their own destruction. Her execution draws thousands. They come expecting to witness defeat, but instead see validation. Esther Cooper walks to the gallows with the same calm determination that guided her through that final night in Hamilton's operating theater. She has proven that resistance takes many forms, that justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice, that even the most helpless can choose their own ending to stories written by others. Her death transforms immediately into legend, her name into code word, her actions into blueprint for those who follow. The ripples spread outward through generations, reaching forward to whisper reminders that power is never permanent, that oppression always plants the seeds of its own undoing, that every system depends on the cooperation of those it claims to control. Remember her name. Remember that history belongs to those brave enough to rewrite its cruelest chapters. Remember that sometimes the most profound act of resistance is refusing to remain silent in the face of systematic horror. And ask yourself, when faced with impossible choices between complicity and consequence, what would you choose? How far would you go to ensure that justice, even delayed, eventually finds its target?